Hello and welcome to episode number 273. This is the Project Management Podcast at pm-podcast.com, and I'm Cornelius Fichtner. You are listening to one of our premium episodes. Thank you for your support of the Project Management Podcast. Your subscription fees help us pay for our expenses. This week we continue our journey into project risk management with a second interview that I did with Dr. David Hilson. We will discuss overall project risk, which is different from individual project risks. At the center of our discussion is the situation when your project sponsor or client asks you, how risky is this project? The concept of overall project risk is mentioned in the PMBOK guide, as well as in the PMI Practice Standard for project risk management, but it seems not too well understood and few project managers are using it. So let's change that. As you'll hear in our conversation, David will be speaking on this topic at an upcoming PMI Congress shortly after we recorded this conversation. He has made his paper that he's going to present there available to us all, and you can download it as part of episode 273 on the podcast website. And now, tell me, how risky is your project?
The Project Management Podcasts feature interview. Today with Dr. David Hilson, the Risk Doctor.
Good afternoon, David, and welcome back to the Project Management Podcast.
Thank you very much, Cornelius. I enjoyed our first conversation. I'm looking forward to this one as well.
Wonderful. Let's jump right in. How do you define the term overall project risk?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And there are, of course, answers which come directly from the PMBOK guide and also from other guides in the world of project management. And so if we went to the PMI Practice Standard for project risk management, which was published in 2009, or the PMBOK guide itself, we have a very clear definition. Most people know the definition of individual risk, an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on a project's objectives. And within the project, there are lots of those. But the Practice Standard and the PMBOK guide also include this other concept, and it says that overall project risk represents the effect of uncertainty on the project as a whole. And it goes on to say this is more than the sum of individual risks on a project. So we have a definition in the PMI world. There are similar definitions in other project management standards and in other risk standards that say there's a concept of overall risk which sits above individual risks, and you can't get to overall risk exposure just by adding up all the individual risks.
You told me before we started this interview, this is a new concept, unlike the discussion we had previously. So why should the concept of overall project risk be of importance to our listeners?
Well, I think most of our listeners will be project management professionals, and quite a lot of them will be project managers. And one of the key questions that you will be asked by your project sponsor or your project owner or your customer is this: how risky is this project? And if we only concentrate on individual risks, our answer is, well, I've got this risk register, and I've got this list of risks, and I've got this report, and I've got this probability impact matrix. The answer is kind of here somewhere. And then the project sponsor or the project owner says, no, those are the risks in the project. I want to know what is the riskiness of the project. And I think we can't answer the question of how risky is this project with a list of risks. It just is a different language. It's a different concept altogether. And overall project risk is designed to answer the question, how risky is the project? Because it measures that riskiness of the overall project as a whole rather than individual uncertainties that might affect progress on the project.
So the overall risk is not just adding up the individual risks?
No, because there are different sources of uncertainty that could affect the whole project, not just the individual risks within the project. So if we think about the kind of pre-definition, the proto-definition of risk as uncertainty that matters, then we can have uncertainties that affect individual project objectives. Those would be our individual risks. So a risk that might affect the timeline, or it might affect the budget, or it might affect the performance requirement, or it might affect safety, or it might affect reputation. What we're looking at with overall project risk is an uncertainty that would affect the whole project. Now, those are, of course, some of those individual risks within the project could affect the whole project, and they contribute to overall project risk. But there are other things which are not risks within the project, which would include our context, the organizational context, the program within which this project sits, the environment that we're delivering our results into, the culture of our own organization and of our client organization. So there are many things which are outside the project which contribute to uncertainty of the project as a whole, in addition to the risky things within the project that the project manager has to manage through the risk register.
Interesting, because when I think of the PMBOK guide and I let the risk management processes sort of fly by in my mind, I don't think that this is addressed in the way that you have just described, that I have to go outside. So why do then common implementations of risk management focus on individual risks, and often why don't they address overall project risk exposure?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head with part of the answer. One is that risk management processes don't describe how to tackle overall project risk. And it's certainly true of the PMBOK Guide, Chapter 11, that it has this definition of overall project risk in the introductory paragraph, para 11.1, but then it doesn't go on to say, and this is how you manage it.
Right.
So people who are following the PMBOK see this concept in the introduction, and then they have no guidance on how to manage it. Fortunately, there is some guidance in the PMI Practice Standard on project risk management, which was published in 2009 and introduced this term to the PMI world. And unfortunately, when we got to the 5th edition of the PMBOK Guide, those of us said, well, this is in the practice standard, and the practice standard sets the context for the PMBOK Guide. The answer we got back was, well, it's a big change. We're not ready for big changes in the 5th edition. It's only incremental changes, and it wasn't included. So we are having this internal discussion within PMI. If you follow the practice standard, you will find some guidance on how to manage it. If you follow the PMBOK Guide, I'm afraid it's silent. But I think there's another thing on why implementations commonly focus on individual risks, and that's because it's easier. We can do our risk workshops and have our probability impact matrices and maybe some Monte Carlo modeling and a risk register, and we can take each one and pick them apart and manage them separately. And that's easy to do. When you think big about the whole project, it becomes a bit overwhelming, a bit more complicated, a bit hard to get your hands around to say, well, how risky is the project as a whole? And how can I manage the riskiness of this project as a whole? And that's much more difficult. So I think the one thing is the processes don't support it. And the second thing is it's much easier just to concentrate on individual risks.
So what does the practice standard say? Can you give us, I don't know, the high-level 10,000-foot overview of what we're supposed to be doing, what tools we're supposed to be using?
I can. Obviously, it's there for people to read. I would say, I suppose I shouldn't be plugging myself, but I am speaking at the PMI Global Congress EMEA, the EMEA Congress in Dubai in May 2014, and my paper is how to manage overall project risk. So that takes the bare bones of the practice standard and puts some flesh on those and says, well, this is how you do it. Because the concept of the practice standard is a kind of high-level statement of principle. And then the idea is that the PMBOK guide gives you the process guidance, the tools and techniques underneath the principle in order to implement it. So there's not a lot of implementation detail in the practice standard. But what it does say is that overall project risk matters, that it needs to be identified. So what is the level of riskiness of this project? It needs to be evaluated. Is it big or small? Is it acceptable or unacceptable? We need to plan responses to it. And you'll recognize here the steps of the risk process I'm going through. So we need to say, well, if this overall project riskiness is too big and bad, we need to mitigate it or reduce it. We need to avoid some elements of overall project risk. But if overall project risk is big and good, then we need to exploit it and we need to enhance that. So we have the same risk response types for overall project risk. And then, of course, you need to implement those, monitor and review and keep it up to date. So we have the same kind of process, identify it, analyze it, plan responses, implement those and review. We're just doing it at the whole project level. And there are techniques that can be followed that will help you to do that.
Well, let me come back to the question that you asked earlier on. how risky is this project? So how should I, as a project manager, answer that question? What would be a proper response from your perspective?
Yes, well, of course, that is the interesting question, isn't it? What units do we use? Do we say, how risky is this project? 7 or 3? What does that mean on a scale of 1 to 10? Or it's red, yellow, green, or it's very risky but not very risky? What are our units? And I think it's very difficult. We do need to have some way of quantifying overall project risk. And we could do it red, yellow, green, of course. But there is obviously a refinement of that, which is to use numbers. So what kind of numbers can we put around overall riskiness of the project? Well, here's 3 things that we could ask specifically. In terms of potential outcomes of the project, let's think about timeline or budget or performance requirement. We could ask this question: what is the potential range of variation in outcome? So clearly, we have a target, but it could be more or less. It could be a little bit more or a lot more. It could be a little bit less or a lot less. One answer to how risky the project is how much variation is possible in the outcome. So could we be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month early, or 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 months late? What's the range? A second number that we can use to quantify overall project risk is to ask the question, how likely is this project to succeed or to fail, I suppose? And that might be a percentage probability. So we could say there's a 30% chance of this project succeeding, a 70% chance of it failing. And that's a number which gives us a measure of overall project riskiness. And a third question would be, what are the main risk drivers for the overall project? And so we can understand where we need to target our attention. So 3 key questions that answer the overall riskiness. How risky is the project? Well, it has this range of variation, plus 20%, minus 5%. We have this probability of success, 20%, 30%, 40%, 60%. And we have this list of drivers which are the main risk factors for the project.
Mm-hmm. But it all seems to be going back to my individual risks in the end. Did I understand that right?
I'm afraid not. I need to explain better, don't I? So I think that it is a similar process. There are similar tools and techniques involved, but we're doing it at a different level. So The key thing here is we're talking about the overall project. So it's not an individual risk and what's the range of variability of output of this risk. If this risk happens, it's plus or minus a couple of weeks. We're saying for the whole project, with all of the threats and opportunities within it and all of the other variability in its context and environment, where could it come out? For the whole project. And part of that will be, as I've said earlier, the contribution of individual risks, but part of it will be these other wider factors within which the whole project sits. And then when we're thinking about probability of success, this is not the probability of individual risks. It's for the whole project, what is the chance of our whole project succeeding? So it's about raising the line of sight, really, raising the visibility. We're not looking at individual tasks or individual objectives or individual work packages. We're looking at the whole project and trying to get a feel for how uncertain that might be.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a look at the percentage of overall success that we have. You mentioned 60%. Let's stick with that number. How did I calculate that?
Well, we do have a very well-proven technique for that. Would you like to guess? No, that's unfair.
Monte Carlo?
Monte Carlo, very good.
Yeah, there we go.
The answer.
All right. Okay, then it's quite clear, yes, because what I meant to say is in Monte Carlo, you still have to use your individual risk with the variability, and that then adds up to an overall risk.
Exactly.
Did I sort of summarize that correctly?
Yes, but a lot of people do Monte Carlo in rather a simplistic way. They take their planned tasks and they go plus or minus a bit. And then maybe they add in some risks out of the risk register, maybe all the red risks or a subset. Well, that's fine. First question, of course, going back to our other conversation is, have we got opportunities in our Monte Carlo simulation as well as threats? But that's a different conversation. The thing is, there are other sources of uncertainty that need to be reflected in our Monte Carlo model apart from just the risks in our risk register. So just like we've said, overall project risk is not just the sum of individual risks.
Right.
The variability in our Monte Carlo output is not just due to risks that might or might not occur. We also have variability on planned tasks. We also have alternative paths. We call those conditional or probabilistic stochastic branches within the model. So we might go one way or we might go the other. We might subcontract or we might do it in-house. That introduces uncertainty. It's an ambiguity risk. It's not a variability risk. It's not a stochastic risk. It's an ambiguity risk. And then we've got the other sort of unknown unknowns, which might just happen in the lifetime of the project and cause further uncertainty. So our Monte Carlo model at the whole project level, of course, it includes individual risks, but it also includes variability in planned tasks. It also includes alternative development tracks or alternative procurement routes. And it also includes something for the level of uncertainty for this kind of project, given its type of innovation or the amount of creativity or new input to the project. So a real Monte Carlo simulation at the whole project level is much, much more than just putting the risks in and seeing what happens.
Right, you're casting a much wider net and you're trying to be much more encompassing, not just your project, other factors as well.
Well, it's all about this project, but it's not just the individual risks in the risk register. It's any source of uncertainty that could affect the project as a whole. So if we went back to that definition of overall project risk from the PMBOK, what we're saying is that overall project risk represents the effect of uncertainty on the project as a whole. So any uncertainty that could affect the whole project, that's what we should be modeling in our Monte Carlo simulation.
Mm-hmm. Critical question. What exactly is the benefit for me as a project manager if my sponsor walks up to me in the hallway and says, "So how risky is your project?"
Well, first of all, I can give him an answer. I don't look embarrassed. I don't look stupid.
Yeah, I don't look like a fool. Yes, exactly. All right.
That's quite important. But also, it helps the project sponsor and the project owner to then give us the level of support that we need. So the project sponsor owns the overall business case. He owns the overall project charter. And it might be that if there are things that are affecting the overall project that are not risks within the project, then we might need the project sponsor's help to manage them because they're outside of our scope as project managers. Now, clearly, if it's an individual risk in the project and I say, here's my top 5 threats and my top 3 opportunities, the project sponsor is quite likely to say, well, I'm glad you've told me, but that's for you to manage. If I say to him, here are some big risk issues that affect the whole project, and they come from the organizational culture and from the environment and from the context of our client and so on, and I can't manage those things because they're outside of the scope of the project, but they affect the project, then we need to get help from the project sponsor or from other people outside the project to help us to manage those. So I think in terms of helping me as the project manager, first of all, I don't look stupid when he asks the question, but also it helps me to ask for assistance when I need it. There are 2 reasons we should escalate risks and communicate risks, and they both start with the letter A. So we should escalate a risk to the project sponsor if it needs his attention or if it needs his action. So attention and action, and both of those are true at the whole project level. If I want to tell you something about the whole project and the riskiness of the whole project, that's for your attention. If I need your help to manage that, it's for your action. If it's within the project, then I'll pay attention to it and I'll take action. But for the whole project, it belongs to the project sponsor.
It seems like a shift in mindset. What do you do with your clients to overcome this kind of shift?
Well, I just ask that question. It's the key question because, we need an answer to that. And I say to them, okay, I see your risk register and we can talk about the quality of the individual risk descriptions and whether your responses are going to be effective or not. But please just tell me, how risky is your project? And they go, blah, 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 I don't know. And then we have the conversation. How could we answer the question?
All right. What's your biggest hurdle? Once you get the idea across that this needs to be done, what's the biggest factor that sort of people resist?
That's easy. People are too busy. Project managers are hugely stressed. We have lots and lots of things to do, more things to do than we have hours in the day or calories in the energy pool. And so we have to prioritize our actions. And of course, it's much, much easier, as I said earlier on, to manage individual risks. And so our focus is on the day-to-day, on the detail, on making sure that our teams are making the progress that they need to, that they have everything they need to do their jobs. And those are the areas of individual risk. And then occasionally we bump into the project sponsor in the hallway, or we have a big project review meeting and we're asked this really difficult question. And we wish they wouldn't ask the question because we don't know how to answer it. and we don't have time to think about it, and we don't have any tools and techniques to help us. So I think the biggest hurdle is that people are too busy with the day-to-day things to raise their sights and think the bigger thing. Now, how do we overcome it? I know that's your next question. I think we need to have two things. One is we in the project management profession and perhaps the risk specialists need to provide some tools and techniques and make this easier for the project manager. And that's the purpose of my paper in the PMI Dubai Congress next week. But also, I think we need to have pull from the top. We need to have project sponsors who are asking the question and who are helping project managers to reach an answer, telling them, this is what I need to know. These are the units I want you to report to me in. I'm glad you're managing the little risks in the project and you're telling me what are the top 10, but please also tell me this, and your risk report is not complete without an answer to the question, well, now how risky is the project? And is it getting better or worse? So if we have that pull from the top, that demand from senior management to say, you need to answer this question, and we give them the tools and techniques to make it easier for them to do that, then I think we'll overcome that hurdle.
All right, I have two closing questions for you. First of all, we do have your paper from the EMEA Congress, and we will put a link in the show notes to that. And we also have a paper that you wrote called Understanding Risk Exposure Using Multiple Hierarchies. I'm also going to put a link to that into the show notes. But where else could our listeners go to learn more about overall project risk?
Well, for those of our listeners who are members of the Project Management Institute, we should be familiar with the practice standard. The PMI Practice Standard for Project Risk Management, published in 2009, I think it's about 100 pages. And as I said, it does explore this concept and in a high level, go through the steps of the process, identification, analysis, response, planning and review, and say how to do that at overall project level as well as individual risk level. So that's a good place to start. And it is, after all, one of PMI's suite of standards, of project management standards, so we should be using it. I think then we need to start talking to our own project sponsors and say proactively, this is obviously important to know how risky the project is. How would you like me to tell you? What information will be useful to you to answer the question? And so we have a kind of requirements clarification discussion with the sponsor to say, I'm going to give you the risk register and a top 10 list and some kind of report, but what else would you like me to tell you to answer the question, how risky is your project? And if we have that individual conversation, we'll start to educate people upwards and develop a solution that works for us in our organization and for our types of projects. So two answers. One is to go to the documentation, to the practice standard, and other textbooks which do mention this. And the other is in practice to talk to the customer of the risk process, which is the project sponsor, and ask them what they want to answer this question.
Well, and with that, you have already answered my second question as well, which was, what do we do once we have studied and learned more about overall project risk?
Yes, we have to do it. It's all about practice and application, of course.
All right. Wonderful. In that case, David, thank you very much for having been back on the program. I appreciate it.
Well, I've enjoyed it very much, and it's good to explore some of these new ideas and have the opportunity just to put some flesh on the bones and explain how they can be practically useful. Thank you very much, Cornelius.
And that was Dr. David Hilson on overall project risk. That's it for today. Thank you very much for listening. If you are a PMP or a PGMP and you're looking for a simple and effective way to earn your PDUs, then try the PDU podcast. Get a new webinar and at least one new PDU every month on autopilot. Stop by at pducast.com. That's pducast.com. As always, you can find us here on the web at pm-podcast.com. So please do send your emails to info@pm-podcast.com, and when you write, tell me where in the world you are writing from. And finally, we have this. Less is more, except when you're doing risk management. Until next time.